get straight on then with the BBC. And last week, Vanessa, the BBC released a documentary about the Captagon trade. Now, Captagon is an amphetamine, a drug. Tell us a bit about this.
Well, basically, this was, yes, as you said, it was a documentary released at the end of June by BBC Arabic, which was then also released on BBC News World Service. They entitled it Syria's Economy Built on Drugs, and the Arabic version had the original title of Captagon Inside Syria's Drug Trafficking Empire, the BBC World Service documentaries.
Yes. So anyway, there were a couple of issues about this documentary, not least some of the people taking part in it, as we're going to see in a second. But I began, when you informed me about this, I decided really the BBC needed to answer a couple of questions. So I sent them this email, which basically said, I'd like to get a statement from the BBC about the apparent closure of BBC Arabic office in Damascus, which I understand has happened on the instructions of the Syrian government in the last few days. Could you also comment on the apparent connection between the closure and the release of the BBC's World Service documentary on Captagon? Finally, I'd like to get a comment from the BBC about why the BBC failed in the Captagon documentary to clearly identify HTS as an alternative name for the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, and the fact that HTS is prescribed under the Terrorism Act 2000. And the reason we were asking that question is because a number of people taking part in that documentary, well, they seem to be members of HTS.
No, they are definitely members of HTS. We've identified them. We've identified the groups that the BBC were focusing on in the documentary. And we actually sent a sort of edited version or a longer version of the complaint that you sent originally, Mike, to Tim Davey, who's the General Director of the BBC, former marketing with Procter & Gamble. I'm sure that has nothing to do with BBC's reporting on COVID. And Tim Orford, Executive Editor of BBC Arabic Service, Head of Programs and Documentaries, who is ultimately responsible for this documentary. And so we changed slightly the final paragraph to asking if we could get a comment from the BBC, please, about why a BBC documentary failed to inform their audience that the organization interviewed in Idlib in Syria are in reality the intelligence arm of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a UK and US prescribed terrorist organization, formerly Jabhat al-Nusra, because in fact HTS sort of split from Al-Qaeda when Abu Muhammad Jolani basically formed an alliance of various terrorist armed groups in Idlib to basically become the controlling element in the northwest of Syria. And that the specific individuals interviewed are responsible for war crimes in Syria, including the murder of children in Idlib. To now, I don't believe we have any response from the BBC, Mike.
Complete and utter silence, absolutely nothing from anybody in response to this. And that was expected, but we had to give them the opportunity to comment on it.
Absolutely. And I think now we've got just a section of the documentary. I recommend that everybody watch the documentary and form their own opinion, but I just wanted to show this section. You can cut it a bit shorter. As long as we get the guy who's sitting in a chair with a covered face, that's all I need, and the beginning of the report, Mike.
It's not only Syria's neighbors who feel targeted. This is Idlib province in northwest Syria. It's one of the last places still held by opponents of Assad's government.
مصادر هاي المخدرات كله من منطقة سيطرة النظام وعم تتوزع بشكل طبيعي حسب سيطرة الفرقة الرابعة. ما في مهرب موجود أو شغال أو كذا إلا ما يكون له علاقات سلطوية. غالب التهريب يغلب عليه الطابع المدني. ليش؟ لأنه المهربين الأساسيين ما هم اللي بينقلوا المادة. إما بيستخدموا أشخاص ضعاف نفوس مشان المال أو يستخدموا الأطفال أو النساء.
At the border crossing, trucks enter Idlib from elsewhere in Syria. Any of them could be carrying a secret cargo. One lorry was recently stopped with hundreds of thousands of Captagon pills.
وردتنا معلومات من مكاتب الرصد الاستخباراتية عن وجود شحنة مخدرات مخبأة داخل سيارة شاحنة نوع براد قادمة من مناطق سيطرة النظام المجرم وبالتحديد من بلدة نبل الواقعة شمال غرب مدينة حلب.
They show us how the...
Thank you, Mike. So first of all, let's have a look at, this is a screenshot from the documentary showing the general administration of border guards. Note that it's written in English and in Arabic, as it always is, of course, with the White Helmet organization also. But who are the Border Security Department, which this is basically what this organization is. They are headed by Abu Ahmed Hudud. Hudud means borders, hence he's heading up the border brigade of HTS, which is effectively Al-Qaeda, or at least has the same ideology. And his mission, or his nickname, was received when he was working with ISIS while in Hasaka before he pledged allegiance to al-Jilani and Al-Qaeda. And he is directly affiliated to Jilani and represents him on many occasions. This guy now, the producer of the documentary, doesn't actually name him in the documentary. She just presents his evidence with his face hidden, and pretty much all of the testimony in the film, the faces are hidden, the voices are muffled. But this is actually Hakim al-Dairi, or Dia al-Din al-Omar, as he's known. He's the spokesman for General Security Agency, which is effectively the intelligence service of HTS run by Abu Maria al-Qahtani, who's an Iraqi very close to al-Jilani. And this shows the link between HTS and the CIA, MI6, and other international intelligence agencies in Idlib. Very important that al-Dairi in 2018, when he was in the northern countryside of Idlib, and just in October 2018, he led an assault in Kafr Halab, fired an RPG missile at a residential home, killing Reem Asaf, that you can see. I've slightly hidden her face in this tweet. From October the 5th, 2018, the child Reem Asaf, 3 years old, was killed, and her older brother, Mohammed, 6 years, was seriously injured, and other family members were seriously injured in this attack that was led by al-Dairi, who the BBC interviewed. And of course, they didn't make clear that this is who he is. They called the group themselves the opponents of Assad. Can we just go back one slide, Mike? Sorry. Now, instead of being held accountable by Jilani, he was actually promoted to security official in Sarmada district in Idlib, and then an official in the Economic Authority in HTS, and a spokesman for the General Security Agency. His brother was governor in Raqqa during the ISIS occupation, and according to civilian testimony, he has carried out campaigns of assassinations, explosions, kidnapping, torture, blackmail, and extortion. And he smuggled explosive detonators to the SDF militia in the northeast. He has also carried out assassinations of rival factions, particularly Haras al-Din, which have been targeted by US drones. And this shows, again, the close collaboration between HTS and the CIA to expand Jilani HTS influence and control of Idlib. But none of this context is mentioned by the BBC. And as this tweet by Michael Hobbs mentions, in May 2014, Raqqa, the same ISIS, is now in Idlib, joining forces with HTS, as I said, the alliance formed by Jilani. So moving on, Mike. So we mentioned that Syria has cancelled the BBC Media accreditation. And I know for sure that it was as a result of this documentary by BBC World Service. But let's look at what the BBC says in response. It said it provided impartial, independent journalism can we speak to people across the political spectrum to establish the facts? I'm not aware that they spoke to anybody in the Syrian government protected areas, and they certainly didn't speak to political factions. They are terrorist factions. So who made this documentary? CIP Senior Fellow Russia Kandil, obviously a correspondent for BBC Arabic, and she had accreditation with BBC Arabic in Syria. That is now cancelled. Centre for International Policy is a Washington Pentagon-linked think tank providing information which influences U.S. Foreign policy. It receives funding from, among others, Open Society, George Soros, and the Ford Foundation, etc. Moving on, Mike. And from this, you can see that she didn't enter Idlib, as always, via the Syrian protected areas. And until now, I don't know whether she had received a visa to actually film in Aleppo and in Tuwaida. I suspect not, because she doesn't actually appear on film during those sections of the documentary. But to enter Idlib, she would have come in illegally, of course, through Turkey with an escort from Al-Qaeda that are in control of Idlib. So moving on again, this documentary was basically made in collaboration with 3 other organizations. The first being, I've just forgotten what OCCRP stands for. It's Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And let's have a look at their backers, Mike. Who supports their work? Well, guess who? So you have Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, the United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the US Agency for International Development, USAID, effectively CIA, the US Department of State, the National Endowment for Democracy, yet again, effectively CIA, and moving on, a number of foundations. Now, Mike, we have asked the OCCRP also for comment, and we've heard nothing back. We've also asked them to let us know how the UK Foreign Office is supporting them, whether it's through direct funding. There are no Foreign Agents Registration Act filings showing any funding for OCCRP. So we are currently investigating whether the Foreign Office is indeed funding them. And just a quick look at some of the elements on the website of this organization. For example, explore the global assets of Russia's oligarchs and enablers, many of them connected, according to them, to Magnitsky and to Navalny. Enough said there, clearly supporting NATO narratives as regards Russia. And the other 2 elements in the production of this documentary are a media company called Daraj, which is Saudi Arabia funded, in Dara in Syria, or I'm sure they're not actually in Dara, but that's basically where it's supposed to be hailing from. And Suwaida 24, backed by Qatar. So again, Saudi money and Qatari money behind the making of this documentary. And moving on again, Mike. So let's see why this documentary was made and point out the fact that, of course, it's working in lockstep with UK-US attempts to further clamp down and punish the Syrian people for resisting the imperialist project that has been ongoing since 2011. So this was an announcement from the foreign... Can you go back a sec, Mike?
Sorry, yeah.
Tackling the illicit drug trade fueling Assad's war machine, the UK and US have imposed more sanctions on those responsible for the illicit Captagon trade, which independent experts estimate could be worth up to 57 billion. Sorry, moving on now.
Yeah.
So let's look at the claims that are being made by Lord Ahmed and the FCO. So they state, as you said, Captagon is a highly addictive amphetamine, and 80% of the world's supply, they are claiming, is produced in Syria. I've had a quick look at a number of very professional reports on Captagon production globally, and they do not agree with this claim. Then they go on to say that the Syrian regime is closely involved in the trade. Again, I have multiple archived reports on the Syrian government's battle against the drug trade. And I have personal experience of speaking to survivors of terrorist attacks who have told me very clearly that the terrorists were taking the Captagon drug from 2011 onwards, and we're being supplied with the drug from Saudi Arabia. So then it goes on to say trade in the drug is a financial lifeline for the Assad regime. It's worth approximately 3 times, etc., etc. It apparently enriches Assad's inner circle militias and warlords at the expense of the Syrian people who continue to face crippling poverty and repression at the hands of the regime, nothing to do with the sanctions that the British government is imposing. He then goes on to say the Assad regime is using the profits from the Captagon trade to continue their campaign of terror on the Syrian people, while the BBC covers up for the fact that the UK is supporting and sponsoring terrorism in the northwest of Syria. And the UK and US will continue to hold the regime to account for brutally repressing the Syrian people and fueling instability across the Middle East. I don't think I need to comment on that. But what it seems to me quite clearly, Mike, is that the BBC here has been tasked with supporting the criminal actions of the UK and US to impose yet further sanctions on both individuals in Syria and to maintain the economic brutality against the Syrian people. Hence, now we have absolutely no electricity in Syria because the US is occupying oil fields, but also because of sanctions.
Yes, okay, thank you very much for that, Vanessa. Now, of course, it's not the first time that the BBC has been caught cavorting with terrorists. If we think back to Saving Syria's Children and some of the background footage that came out around that, they were busy doing that as well. But while we've got this diversion of Hugh Edwards going on at the moment, of course, we've had no response out of the BBC about this. They do have some significant questions to answer here.
Absolutely. Well, just the framing of this story, that they leave out the fact that it's terrorist-occupied Idlib. It's kind of an important contextual point to the story, isn't it? But they've made them look official. They've got little dog sniffer, drug-sniffing dogs, so they all have been trained for the cameras. It all looks very sort of official, but most people don't realize what Idlib actually is in Syria.
Yes.
So, and they've whitewashed it in this BBC program.
Indeed. Well, thanks very much to Vanessa for that. Now, she is obviously short of electricity, so hopefully she will be back later on for extra. But in the meantime, I would like to encourage everybody that's watching this, that watched Vanessa's report there, to perhaps ask Mariana Spring, since she's so keen to fact check things and make sure that everything's correct. Ask Mariana Spring what BBC Verify can discover about this particular report, and well, maybe they might have something to say about it. Let's move on.